This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Why is everybody so happy today?
Because guess who's back? Hannah's back. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve and David.
Great to have you back. And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
First up on today's program, we welcome back our resident constitutional expert, Bruce Fein. He and Ralph are going to make the case for impeaching everyone, the Supreme Court and the president. They're going to take us through every aspect of this process, the history, the state of play right now, and what we as citizens can do to make it happen. Next up, global trade expert Lori Wallach, director of Rethink Trade, joins us to talk about Trump's tariffs. Are they doing what Trump promised they would do? Are they bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.? Are they making money for the U.S. Treasury? Or is Trump just using the tariffs as a cudgel to punish countries that annoy him? Lori will evaluate all of that for us in the second part of today's program. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, is impeachment just a pipe dream? David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome back. Well, we have a full-fledged Trumpian dictatorship underway, digging deeper, poisonous roots, being bolder, kidnapping more and more people off the streets without due process, without probable cause, and in every area of American life. So let's start, Bruce, with your take on the astounding surrender by the Supreme Court majority, 6-3, and what it means for accountability of the president.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I think that the evidence has been assembled, at least since Trump versus United States decided about a year ago, July 1, 2024, in which 6-3 majority held that the president of the United States is constitutionally shielded from criminal prosecution for crimes committed, in his official capacity. Crimes like treason, crimes like extortion, crimes like assassination. A truly stunning opinion, especially since there was no precedent in any lower court that even plausibly endorsed that idea. And secondly, the court abandoned all of its so-called conservative canons of construction to reach this extraordinary conclusion. Since Mr. Trump has taken office since January, the court has operated what is popularly called a shadow docket. That is, taking cases from Mr. Trump where he is seeking to stop the enforcement of numerous lower court decisions, arresting his effort to unilaterally dismantle the Constitution, the statutes of this country, the executive branch. One example among many, his executive order, after 157 years, declaring that Section 1 of the 14th Amendment doesn't really confer birthright citizenship on anybody he claims was a child to persons who are not here legally. And what are these shadow docket decisions? They are made without briefing on both sides, made with very, very little understanding of the lower court decisions, made without oral argument. There's no transparency. It operates like the British Star Chamber centuries ago. It's made without any explanation of the majority as to why they have stopped enforcement of these lower court decisions. It's just there's a stay without any indication how long the stay will continue.
This has real consequences for you people all over the country, because one of their shadow docket decisions without explanation or hearing briefs just very recently said that Trump can fire all these people in the IRS or the Education Department or EPA and get away with it and, in effect, paralyze the workings of a statutorily established by Congress cabinet secretary and department. In other words, he basically repeals the statute establishing the Department of Education by firing everybody. And the Supreme Court said the district court order that he can't do that has been stayed, in other words, suspended until sometime later when the Supreme Court gets around to it and here's a regular oral argument on it. So this is devastating to your health, economic safety, environment, workplace safety, education, all kinds of things that are being ridden into the ground, Head Start, Medicaid, the Meals on Wheels, inspiring 25,000 IRS staff, many of which are going after big corporate crooks and the super rich evasion, environmental control of air and water pollution, law enforcement, and it just goes on and on. All the so-called savings don't amount to a fraction of the $150 billion additional dollars he's adding to the military budget without any hearings in Congress, and the $43 billion added to the Department of Homeland Security to establish concentration camps. That's what they are, private prisons, concentration camps that are going to be built around the country to hold immigrants who have not been convicted of any crime or properly arrested. They're just going to rot year after year unless some other country is willing to take them after being paid by the U.S. taxpayer. Now, Bruce, you have developed a bill of particulars, impeachable reasons, to be applied to the 6 majority on the Supreme Court. And this, listeners, is extremely fundamental because it doesn't have anything to do with 1 or 2 or 3 bad decisions.
We have a court that systematically, not just one case, over and over and over again, has permitted Mr. Trump to do whatever he wants, including sending immigrants to nations where the risk of torture or death is very high. Well, how are you going to redress something of that sort? You can't do that. And moreover, the fact of the matter is that by issuing these stay orders and freeing the president to wreak havoc before you could get a final judicial decision, basically making these decisions able to inflict irreparable harm. You cannot build up these institutions again from ground one, certainly not in any kind of lifetime. Take the Department of Education, where the court has said you can basically turn it into a shell of what it was before. You can de facto eliminate the agency by firing employees willy-nilly and then telling the employees who do show up, don't enforce any of the laws. That's okay as well. And you can see after a court decision, months or a year down the road, says this is all illegal, how are you going to build it up again? Who's going to come and want to work for the Department of Education again? Who would ever want to sign a contract with the Department of Education? It becomes virtually impossible to rebuild. And that's why, in my judgment, the court has basically abandoned its role as a check on executive power rather than a license. It's actually become an appendage of the executive branch. Nothing placing any kind of serious or material handcuffs on what the president can do on his own, and the president taking full advantage of that. Now, we do run into this paradox, if you will. Suppose that these justices are impeached. Who appoints their replacements? Donald Trump, and we know what that would be. He would replace them with carbon copies of the current situation, and he's controlled right now with the Republicans in the Senate. It probably would get confirmed again. So we have this political dilemma. How do you get rid of justices who deserve impeachment when they can be replaced by carbon copies by an executive branch, and you have a pliable Congress who's not willing to stand up? It's only we, the people, are the last safeguard. We, the people, have to insist that Congress actually step up to the plate, exercise its constitutional duties and responsibilities, impeach, in my judgment, not only these justices who have abandoned their duties as the third branch of government, but Mr. Trump himself.
Let's get into that. John Boniface is leading a petition drive all over the country. Hundreds of thousands of citizens have already signed up to impeach. And we're seeing more and more Trump voters saying, I didn't vote for this, I didn't vote for that. So why don't you go through the impeachment particulars?
We have Mr. Trump using executive orders to violate the Constitution, trying to end birthright citizenship for 157 years for anyone born in the United States, clearly the language of the 14th Amendment, Section 1. And then we have the Supreme Court acquiescing in this flagrant illegality by saying that the lower court decisions protecting those persons who are born in the United States from their citizenship have to be undertaken on a retail basis, can't be done nationwide. even though it's obvious that the Section 1 applies nationwide. And moreover, in this particular case, it is as preposterous to believe that Trump's executive order will survive scrutiny as it was when he was arguing to Mr. Pence and all the nation that under the 12th Amendment, the vice president decides who wins presidential elections. It's a clear loser. Then he claims the power simply to ignore federal laws. Not only TikTok, which should have been banned January 19th, he's just said, I don't want to comply with the law. He said, I'm not going to enforce the Federal Corrupt Practices Act. I'm not going to enforce the Federal Agents Registration Act. I'm not going to enforce any law that I simply don't like. In other cases, like with regard to Eric Adams, he says, I'm not going to prosecute people, even if they've committed crimes, because I think they may help me out on immigration. If he doesn't, he's not enforcing laws that he ought to be enforcing relating to environmental protection. He simply strips EPA of any manpower and says, we're not going to enforce these provisions. Labor Department protecting individuals from black lung disease. Basically, he's saying that I can choose which laws to enforce and which not. And ponder just a second here, Ralph. That means that a congressional statute, he can basically nullify unilaterally by simply saying, so what? I have absolute veto power. That's what it is. The Constitution provides qualified veto power. But under Trump's theory, even if Congress passed a law that he vetoed and Congress override it, he says, so what? I can just decide I don't want to enforce the law. He turns the constitutional provision that the president is obligated to faithfully execute the laws. It's enshrined in Article 2. He turns it on and says that I have the right to unfaithfully not execute the laws with impunity. There's no oversight. Congress doesn't issue any subpoenas to him. Most of this is done without knowing exactly the reason for what he's plotting one way or the other. He's flouting the Impoundment Control Act. He's not spending money that Congress has appropriated for various and sundry purposes. He's violated the Anti-Deficiency Act because he made obligations to spend money to pay the salaries accrued by persons who would voluntarily leave the federal government without any appropriations for that measure. In all these ways, he's completely torn asunder.
And he shut down the Agency for International Development, which is now causing thousands of preventable deaths in places like Africa, in absence of AIDS medicine, feeding supplements, clean drinking water.
He's saying basically, Ralph, I can shut down any agency I want on my own, whether created by Congress. I'll simply tell the people who show up, don't do any work, or I'll fire them. And how can the Supreme Court be so clueless as to what's going on? We gave the green light, to the Education Department to be dismantled. I mean, in theory, it's the end of any kind of separation whatsoever, because the president can make null and void every single congressional statute by simply saying, I'm not going to have anybody around to enforce it. They can stay on the payroll, but they won't do anything. And if I don't want them on the payroll, at least the Supreme Court says in the short run, you can fire them, although it's probably violating the civil service statute. So we have a completely president out of control. And you have to ask, I ask myself, is this Supreme Court been like Rip Van Winkle sleeping for the last 20 years? Anybody who has a brain can see exactly what Trump's modus operandi and what his ambition is. He said openly, I'm not clear to me. I have to follow my oath of office to uphold the Constitution. He's already said, well, I may run for president in 2028, despite the 22nd Amendment. I mean, how many times does he have to sound the alarm that this guy is totally indifferent and clueless and indifferent to his constitutional obligations?
How about his extortion? Talk about his chronic extortion.
So what he does to extort favors from various components, colleges, universities, law firms, he says to them, listen, you do what I tell you to do. You fire the people I want you to fire. You teach and you promote and represent the people I want you to promote, or else I'm going to have the federal government come after you. We can concoct excuses under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. We're going to tell you that you're representing terrorists or you're a terrorist. We will harass you unless you capitulate to us. This is extortion. That is using threats to invoke legal authority to obtain something that you're not entitled to as of right. And it's systematic.
How about shakedown extortion at ABC, CBS? Explain that.
Well, here, the difficulty, Ralph, is because these people are letting themselves be extorted. But what he does, he files these frivolous lawsuits with media companies, which need official government approval to have various license exchanges or mergers. And then they go ahead and say, okay, it's worth it to capitulate to these absurd claims. I mean, one against CBS said 60 Minutes edited an interview with Kamala Harris. that didn't satisfy Mr. Trump. So he sues them for $16 million. It is a completely absurd claim under existing law, but they go ahead and commit. Oh, well, we'll go ahead. We'll settle the case, which they did, $16 million. And we know this is extortion. He got the $16 million, says he's diverting it to one of his charities or whatever, but you know what a Trump charity looks like, not the ones that you think we look like that. A Trump charity is the one who believe they need to give special dispensation to the white Afrikaners who are being allegedly persecuted in Africa, so they get citizenship rights here in the United States. That's his view of charity.
Well, let's say the polls drop for the Republicans. They're facing disaster in 2026 in Capitol Hill. It's their political skin or Trump, and they do what their predecessors did with Nixon, basically telling him, your time is up. So either he resigns ahead of being removed when things have deteriorated, as they are now, week by week, in terms of dictatorial outrages and illegalities, and that puts Vance in the presidency. So some people are saying, well, why is that any improvement?
Well, the improvement is because it comes on the heel of a precedent. I can guarantee you, J.D. Vance, that we know how he lusts for power. 2 years before he became the ninth presidential running mate with Trump, he called Trump Adolf Hitler. So he doesn't have any principles other than lusting for power for its own sake. And because the precedent of removing Mr. Trump would have a deterrent effect, and the Congress would tell Mr. Vance, you do what Mr. Trump's going to do, we'll impeach and remove you as well. So he'll go ahead and he'll change his tune like he did before for political ambition. He wants the power. So the idea that the precedent would not have any deterrent effect is ridiculous and absurd. I know, having served in the Reagan administration after the resignation of Mr. Nixon because of the impeachable offenses that had been voted by the House Judiciary Committee before they got to a trial, there was oftentimes in the White House, in Justice Department, you can't do this, you're going to get impeached like Richard Nixon. So that it even had a deterrent effect, even though it didn't go all the way to impeachment because it came of resignation, because people are in politics because they love power. You're not going to commit suicide by doing what Trump did and risk getting impeached himself. So that's why the suggestion that a J.D. Vance after a Trump impeachment and removal is going to be the same J.D. Vance before is an absurd proposition. Don't worry. He'll change coloration 100%.
Well, I saw some listeners saying, what about past presidents, Clinton, Biden, George W. Bush? They all committed impeachable offenses, which is true. But the scale here, listeners, is just staggering. If you aggregate what he's doing, and every time he violates a critical law that's so essential to the American people, or he initiates some policy, he said, this is only the beginning.
That's certainly true, Ralph. We have to acknowledge that other presidents who committed impeachable offenses have not been impeached. But I can't say that I've been trying to get presidents impeached with Clinton, after Clinton, Bush, Cheney, Obama, Biden, Trump, everyone. So it's not for lack of trying. But the fact is that it's better to have imperfect justice than none whatsoever. So that's a partial answer.
But moreover, there is a difference in degree here.
Oh, of course there are.
Trump is unraveling the social safety net for tens of millions of Americans, blue state,
there's no doubt.
We've heard about Medicaid. We've heard about the feeding programs. We've heard about air and water pollution being dismantled. No other president is so completely dismantling the social safety net in favor of further immunity for corporate welfare, corporate crime wave, unenforced, firing the law enforcement officials, getting the sheriffs off the corporate crime beat, as well as loading the military budget beyond the wildest schemes of prior presidents. So we're dealing here with installing the corporate state, which Franklin Delano Roosevelt called in a message to Congress in 1938, fascism. And so this is, listeners, a difference in degree to such a degree that it has become a difference in kind.
I would agree, but you still meet the threshold of impeachable offenses. The whole idea of impeachable offenses is prophylactic. You don't wait till it gets as bad as Trump in order to exercise the power. In my judgment, if things were done earlier, Trump, he'd already been deterred from his outrages that we see every day today. But I would certainly agree that Trump has taken it to a complete level. I mean, just the statement that he made that it's not clear to him that he has to obey his oath of office. He just kind of light a match to the Constitution, as itself takes it to a whole new level. I mean, nobody else could have conceived of ever stating that. Even if they believed it, they wouldn't be so open about it. And was clear given the systemic nature of what Trump is doing, that he has no intent of ever leaving office, whether he runs again or just calls out the military, unless he's removed by impeachment and the American people. So I'm not trying to suggest that Trump isn't a matter of, it's taking this to a whole new level.
So what do you see for the people of this country? What do they have to do in the next few weeks and months?
Okay, so and you mentioned that John Bonifaz, he heads a group called freespeechforpeople.org. You can get it online, and he's gathered at least over 250,000 petition signatures supporting impeachment as a concept. But my belief is, and you could go and help and boost John Bonifaz, Bonifaz, and his group. But the most, I think, direct and influential approach is to contact the office of your member of Congress and Senate, either by email, phone call, hard copy letter, fax, or otherwise, demanding that they enforce the impeachment clause, that whether you're a Republican or Democrat, your highest oath is to the Constitution of the United States, and you have someone in office who is an obvious arsonist on that score. And you need to distinguish between the firefighter and the fire. Fire is Donald Trump. Firefighter is the Constitution of the United States. And make that clear. You may think just one phone call or one email is not going to matter. Collectively, it matters a whole lot. That is how the Nixon presidency ended, because there were 30,000 calls into the Congress per week after the Saturday Night Massacre. The influence was there. Even in a non-impeachment setting, there was overwhelming public opposition to President Obama's effort to get a declaration of war against Syria in 2013, and even the most firm war hawks like Ted Cruz decided to back away. So the members of Congress, if they have to choose between their political skin and Trump's, they'll choose theirs every time. But you got to make it clear to them, you're not voting for them again unless they stand up and faithfully execute their oath of office, defend, preserve the Constitution of the United States.
Remember, listeners, Trump gets bolder by the day. He's inciting more violence. He is boldly violating more laws. And unless he's stopped, it's going to be even harder to exercise any tool in the Constitution to hold them accountable.
You have to enforce the law. It's not self-executing. You have to have people will stand up and vote. And that was made very disappointing with a recent vote in the House on the Al Green impeachment resolution.
Well, on that note, we have to conclude. Is there anything else you'd like to leave with our listeners for them to do so they don't get too overwhelmed and discouraged?
I just make two observations. Don't be discouraged because it doesn't look like it's not going to happen tomorrow. When the Nixon impeachment inquiries basically began in April of 1973, I remember they were on the heels, Ralph and Steve and David, on the overwhelming victory by President Nixon over George McGovern in 72, over 60% of the popular vote, 520 electoral votes, 49 out of 50 states, and a vastly greater political mandate than anything enjoyed by Donald Trump. Despite that mandate, within 16 months, he was out of office, and his popularity had plunged to 24%. But that was a slow accretion of involvement of citizens and listening and paying attention and being aware and alert to the constitutional problems and the threat to our self-governance if Nixon's crimes were committed without him being removed from office. So it can take time.
As Trump's tariff policies and others shake the economy, increase inflation, increase unemployment, that will send its own message. You're fired. Sure. And remember, listeners, he's doing this to people in the red states and blue states. He's doing this to his own voters. The biggest beneficiaries of the solar and wind power programs are in the South. All kinds of businesses are having their business contracts canceled. They don't know what the future lies for them. These are Trump voters. At any rate, stay in touch, stay informed, and this subject will only get more intensive in the coming months. Thank you very much, Bruce Fein.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Bruce Fein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. When we come back, it's Tariff Talk with Lori Wallach of Rethink Trade. Does Trump have any idea what he's doing? But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 18, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A tax whistleblower will get a check for $20 million in a case that resulted in $88 million in taxes returned to the Treasury in connection with the whistleblower's disclosure. Thanks to a courageous whistleblower, the IRS collected over $88 million in taxes from 80 millionaires seeking to evade taxes, said one of the whistleblower's lawyers, Stephen Cohen. As important as the direct result of the whistleblower's actions resulting in $88 million in taxes being collected, equally important is the deterrent impact on those thinking about cheating on their taxes. A strong tax whistleblower award program brings dollars in directly, but as much, if not more dollars indirectly through improved compliance by taxpayers. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Hey, do you like roller coasters? Then you'll love Donald Trump's tariff policy. David?
Lori Wallach is a 30-year veteran of international U.S. congressional trade battles, starting with the 1990s fights over NAFTA and WTO when she founded the Global Trade Watch Group at Public Citizen. She is now the director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project and a senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign, a national coalition of unions and environmental, consumer, faith, family farm, and other civil society groups working for social and environmental justice and trade policy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Lori Wallach.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back, Laurie. Our listeners are ready to get educated on this whole subject of tariffs, which Donald Trump seems to be unilaterally articulating and dominating in the news. But when he was running for president, he said the tariffs were going to pay for a lot of the cuts in his legislation to Congress. Does anybody know how many dollars these tariffs have collected since January 20th?
Well, we basically have had more than $100 billion for the first time in a very, very, it's already that much in a fiscal year. It's the most it's been for a very long time. So it is bringing in a bunch of money. The thing is, the way they're targeted, the way they're working is not going to deliver on what was the real reason he claimed to do tariffs, which was to rebalance trade, to rebuild our industrial capacity, which we need for national security and basically resilience purposes, and to re-employ a lot of manufacturing workers, so workers without a college degree would have great jobs making the things we need. None of those things are being delivered on, but yes, he is raising some revenue, but really a drop in the bucket relative to all the revenue he's going to lose with his grandiose tax cuts for the 1%, his low corporate tax rate. And even with all the massacre he's making on food and nutrition and health policies, he still is not going to make up enough tariff revenue to balance the budget.
Well, he brags a lot about what these tariffs are doing or going to do by shaping up our trading partners to be less unfair. But now the word in the New York Times is that European businesses are unable to plan because he zigzags so much. Tariffs on, tariffs off, deadline here, deadline deferred. You think there's going to be some real realignment among our trading partners that will be fairly permanent and damage the U.S.? I know that the U.S. has been losing soybean sales to China and Japan to Brazil big time, and that preceded Trump, but it's accelerating now. But what's going on overseas in terms of their reaction other than dismay and despair? Are they reordering their own trading alignments?
Well, what's interesting is if you look at the whole world and map out who is a balanced country with the whole world, who's a surplus country, and who's a deficit country. In the last 15 years, as China has more and more been using mercantilist policies to boost its exports, it's now literally 15 to 17 countries that have huge global trade surpluses. China by far the biggest, $1 trillion. Germany's next, about $300 billion. Then you've got Korea, Japan, Taiwan at about 120 billion apiece. There's a handful of countries that, using mercantilist policies, basically are exporting more than they would if it were just the market. And now, instead of it being the US being like the only big deficit country, but we're the biggest by far, there are now 66 other countries that have huge, honking, chronic trade deficits. And here's the shocker, Ralph. It's Brazil, it's India, it's BRICS countries, it's the big developing countries, it's Mexico. With all of their trade surplus, they send us more stuff than we send them. They have a huge deficit with the rest of the world. And that's basically because of this imbalance that is being caused by China. So now what's happened basically is that even with the tariffs reduced by Trump, some of the stuff that had been sent here, because we have the biggest trade deficit in the world, $1 trillion in the history of the world, that stuff is now heading to Europe. So yes, there are rebalancings, not strategically, like if this was being done strategic, we would have gotten with all those deficit countries, all the balanced countries, and basically said, hey, all of us club of this system is really bad for us. Let's get together and let's have external tariffs on China. And let's just start that right away with the Germany's, Japan, Korea, et cetera. Let's say, guys, you've got to knock off your mercantilist policies. You get 6 months to do it. Otherwise, you're going to have tariffs. And then we would have had most of the world united trying to rebalance trade and distribute manufacturing by basically stopping the behaviors that have unfairly concentrated it in a few places. Instead of doing that, yes, we are redistributing trade because now Europe is putting up tariffs against China because all the junk that was being dumped on us is now looking for someplace else. But we're such a huge importer that there is no other place that's going to absorb. Now, the way they're doing it is not translating, though, in the US manufacturing capacity being increased. Because you need to do those tariff defenses. But if we're really trying to actually rebuild our capacity, create more good manufacturing jobs, you need a bunch of other industrial policies to create demand for American-made stuff domestically, to create investment in the sectors where you want to have capacity. The Biden folks did that. Too slow, too little, wasn't perfect, but they did it and it worked. And we saw the highest rate in industrial investment in the United States by 2023 that we had had in 30 years. And we saw an increase in industrial capacity. But these guys are just it's basically like trying to build a house with just a hammer. We are against saws. We are against screwdrivers. We do not actually believe in nails, no other tools. We will just hammer a bunch of wood. And as a result, we're going to make some noise and we're definitely going to break some things, but we're not actually building a new redistributed trade system, which we could.
Well, listeners should know that Larry Wallach has this very clear and elaborate evaluator on Trump's tariff trade deals in terms of what they impact the U.S. And I want you to go through the ones because you flash some are green and some are red in terms of their impact. But just from the point of view of the consumer listening, we have a weaker dollar now. The tariffs are starting to bite on some consumer products, clothing, for example. Give us an update on how it's beginning to affect the pocketbook, the weaker dollar and the transfer of tariffs to consumer price increases.
Unless you're a recovering trade attorney like me, you hear about these deals, you hear the parts of them, and you're like, what does that mean for my life? Like, what is that? A non-tariff barrier. Do I care about that? Can I eat that? Do we import that? So what I basically did is I boiled it down to English. And this is to evaluate when they announce these deals. So let's just talk about Brazil. Let's put the deals with Brazil that have been announced in the last couple of days. Let's just put it through the evaluator. So what the evaluator does is it has a list of the things that you would have in these policies if you were trying to deliver on Trump's promises. Number one, to rebuild American manufacturing. Again, that's a good goal. We should do that. To create good manufacturing jobs, we should do that. And to rebalance trade. And we need to do that. There are things you would do if you were trying to actually do what he said he was going to do. And then there are a whole bunch of things that you would definitely not do unless you're trying to just help big pharma, big tech, the usual neoliberal garbage. So the green stuff on this tariff deal tester are the things that all of us consumers should look at and see, all right, is this actually going to deliver? So it's things like, number one, the things should target countries we have a trade deficit with. You shouldn't go after the countries where we are selling them more stuff than we are importing. That would be counterproductive to actually raise the cost of trading. So let's look at Brazil. We actually have a trade surplus with Brazil. We do not have a deficit with Brazil. So number one, no, it is not a deficit country. So that's not looking optimistic that this is a deal that's actually about what Trump said he was going to do. Does it have rules that counter environmental dumping, i.e. externalizing environmental costs by basically dumping toxins in the air, the water, the ground? No, it does not have anything like that. Does it have something to counter wage suppression by busting unions? Because that's another way to trade cheat. You don't allow any kind of labor rights and no one can ever have a better wage. Nope, nothing in there about that. Does it discipline over capacity subsidies, the government intervening? Does it discipline the lack of competition enforcement? No, actually a big Brazilian company is the big meatpacking monopolist. The US has a food trade deficit for 10 years. Nothing in there on that. So you go through these different things that could make a difference. None of the good stuff is in that Brazil deal. All right, what the hell is in there? Okay, big tech oversight is weakened. Well, that's not good, but that's the number one thing they listed yesterday when they announced a new big trade investigation against Brazil. It's to investigate violations on Brazil abusing American big tech. And what they think is abusing is guaranteeing privacy rights online, trying to bust up the monopolies, trying to ensure there's data security so we don't get scammed. That's what they're doing for big tech, not for manufacturing, not for American consumers. That's basically abusing. It's like saying, hi, we want big tech to abuse you the way they abuse us here. We don't have any of these rules, Brazil. You need to get rid of those rules. Or are there environmental policy attacks or food policy attacks or other things that are for big corporate interests? Well, there's a whole thing about intellectual property. Yes, they're actually trying to raise medicine prices in Brazil for big pharma instead of doing anything about US jobs or US trade balance. So if you go through the final one on this list, there are two final ones, but they're non-trade related things that get in the way of actually using the leverage of tariffs about jobs. And that's the number one thing with this Brazil deal. This Brazil deal is all about Trump basically trying to help Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil who lost, who then started a coup, who then failed to overthrow the government and is now being tried for it. And perhaps Trump is having a but for the grace of God go I moment. But whatever it is, the dude is out there trying to help Bolsonaro. And he said it publicly when he announced the first tariffs of 50%. He said, this is about the abuse of my friend, Jair Bolsonaro. And then they've been backfilling, trying to have any economic sense. So on my evaluator, one of the things you get the worst score for is non-trade demands. Deal is conditioned on trade partners ceding territory, geopolitical demands, and other untrade-related leverage. Well, that's what this whole thing is about. So literally, they're getting goodies for big tech and big pharma because Trump wants to help a failed wannabe dictator's coup, and there's no upside for U.S. workers, manufacturing, or trade balance. And that's how you use this to evaluate each one of the deals.
How do people get a hold of your evaluator? What website has it clearly on?
Rethinktrade.org. Rethinktrade.org. It's the number one thing on the top of the page.
I don't think listeners is anything like this in terms of comprehensively engaging you in the pluses and minuses of tariffs. I don't know who Trump listens to. Does he have technical advisors? Or is it just off-the-cuff announcements on his Truth Social? Does he listen to anybody when he makes these announcements and zigs and zags and threats?
I'm sad to say, best I can tell, he's doing it on his own because on the regular, he's got some very good advisors. The guy who's the top trade ambassador is a very smart, capable guy. And on the regular, that guy and also his commerce secretary, his treasury secretary say one thing, and then within hours, Trump is doing something totally different. And so it is a mystery where some of this stuff actually is coming from. And best we can tell, the dynamic is something like Trump is so engaged in the fun and chaos, fun from his perspective, and chaos of throwing tariff news around like a lightning bolt, that he really is not taking advice from people who know how to do it, about how you could use tariffs to try and ostensibly achieve the things he promised. He's just enjoying throwing around tariffs. And the thing that, to get to your other question, Ralph, about what's it doing for consumers, again, if you go to rethinktrade.org, there are a couple of briefing papers about when tariffs do get passed through into consumer prices and when they don't, so that people can judge. It's not clear exactly how much pass-through is happening right now, actually, despite all these additional tariffs, because everyone says, like, oh, he's put off the tariffs. But actually, we have more tariffs right now than we've had for 100 years, and thus the $100 billion of tariff revenue. But despite that, up until this most recent inflation read, there hasn't been an inflationary effect, which is to say that it's not being passed through yet.
Well, let me give you an example. There's probably our listeners buy products from LL Bean or Vermont Country Store. I checked the LL Bean catalog, and 96% of its products are imported because they indicate after every product whether it's imported or not. Now, there's no way LL Bean is going to not increase prices to millions of its consumers around the country, is there?
Well, see, here's the question. So when LL Bean lists, say, a T-shirt that is $20 or whatever, its cost to them coming from Vietnam or Bangladesh or China is $1, is 50 cents. It is so much less. And that's the landed price. That's the actual shirt. That's the schlepping it from Asia on a boat. That's the processing it. That is the tariff payment. That is them putting it in a truck and sending it to a distribution center. The markup in retail in most of these things is so high that there is room. So, like, for instance, in the first round of tariffs, what the most comprehensive study showed is that a lot of companies that had a lot of imports just absorbed they basically took a little piece out of their profit margin. They absorbed the cost of the tariffs and didn't pass it through. And that's particularly in sectors where there's any kind of competition. If it's a total monopoly, they can get away with it. So like in the grocery store sector, you do see prices go up even when there aren't tariffs because there's so few grocery chains and there's so few wholesalers that they can get away with it. But in other areas, there is more price competition and there is a huge markup. So like everyone who pays $120 for that pair of Nikes, the landed price for those shoes, again, the tariffs, the transportation, everything is $18, $20. So if there is even a 50% tariff on that, and it's now going to cost $30, you can still make a lot of money in between that markup. So dependent, it's not passed on. The place where things get passed on is the stuff that's super cheap. So like the Walmart t-shirts that are in a package of 3 of them for $10, where it's closer to the margin, or the dollar store t-shirt that's $1.99, where like the cost of that's maybe 5 cents, that's more likely to get marked up a little bit. But it's pennies.
These are staggering markups that you just mentioned about LL Bean. Anyway, this is something for consumers to be very aware of because Trump is afraid of inflation. The business community doesn't seem to be standing in any coordinated fashion on these tariffs. They seem to be in disarray or watchful waiting or just observing instead of their usual lobbying hard? Or is this going on behind the scenes, trying to get waivers and all?
I think it's a mix. I think that there are certain industries that have come to the conclusion that they're going to have to move their production out of China to different places. And they'd already started thinking about that for some period of time, almost as a national security measure. They've seen on a bipartisan basis now, for instance, high tariffs on China. Trump won, Biden kept them and raised them, Trump too. I think that there are sectors of retail importers, so like the clothing and footwear importers, the retailers, they still want to not have to make anything here. There are different sectors, I think, are responding differently. But I think, honestly, part of the reason why what's happening is industry goes to Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and makes a special pleading and sometimes gets a special deal instead of saying anything publicly, is that they are afraid that Trump is going to personally go after their company and try and do some illegal thing that they can't stop fast enough in court to try and shut them down, to hurt them in a way that is outside the rule of law.
The solar distribution industry is really hurting here because they're going to see higher tariffs on solar panels from China.
Here's the story. The U.S. is now making solar panels because of the Biden policies that put together demand, so the tax credits that the Republicans have just gotten rid of, so we all want to get American solar, the investment in more capacity. The reason that Biden waited a year before putting the tariffs on the subsidized Chinese solar panels was so that we would have the ability to make more of them here. Because, Ralph, a bunch of that Chinese solar is actually being made by Uyghur forced labor. Like the silicon is being made in plants in the northwest corner of China by the million Muslim minority Uyghur, Tajik, and other residents of China, of Greater China, who are basically being rounded up and put into forced labor. We don't want that crap. Like, it's not only that if we have those kind of products coming here, we'll never be able to make our own, but also just as a moral matter, we don't want that stuff. The tariffs basically allow solar panels made in other Asian countries that don't use forced labor, that aren't subsidized illegally, etc. We are importing a bunch. But those Chinese panels, the industry that wants to just import the cheap ones and put them up is mainly a financing industry. They finance big projects. I'm on the side of the people who want to actually make them here and distribute them and then put them up with union labor. And there are two tracks of this. There's that team, and then there's team import them cheap and let me make a big return on my investment, because those are the ones that are the industrial scale. The big sort of financed projects where you have, miles and miles of solar panels for utility. Those are the guys who want to take that grade of panels and bring them in. And it's basically how much return are they going to get in that investment? They could still make them in the US and just make a little bit less return on their huge investment. But those are financing companies. I have less concern about how they go as compared to what happens to the companies that are trying to actually manufacture them here. So we're not so reliant on imports.
Let's go to Steve.
Laura, you talked about tariff revenue and the tariffs that are in place, they are making money. Well, who is paying that money and who is getting that money?
So the money goes generally into the Treasury. It's not like going into like rebuilding U.S. manufacturing, which is where I would like to see it go. And who's paying for it kind of depends on the arrangement with the companies involved. So the actual payment is made by the company that is importing the stuff. They pay the US Treasury, and they do it through an agency called the Customs Department, and they do it at a customs office or online in a port. But practically who's paying for it, a lot of it gets split. So for instance, a US importer of clothes will say, hey, China, now your clothes have this tariff on them. And as a result, my profits are going to go down because my margin's big, but I want to make all the money, not just most of the money. And then they'll say, we're going to relocate our sourcing to Vietnam. This is our last order. Your tariffs suck. And then what typically happens is the company that's making the stuff in China that's selling it then will offer to split the tariff cost. And so the Chinese company will then pay the US company half of it. And then the US company actually pays the Treasury, but it's half of their money and half the tariffed country's money. And if you're a big enough purchaser, you can pull those kind of games because they don't want to lose, the manufacturer in China doesn't want to lose your business. Now, the people who get screwed are the US small companies, retailers, Main Street stores. You can't do that kind of Amazon maneuver or Kmart maneuver or Walmart maneuver where you have that leverage. And so US small businesses are paying the full freight of the tariffs. And there's a crisis of Main Street businesses that are getting clobbered because they can't negotiate that. And then those are, Ralph, the companies that are most likely to have to pass it through to their consumers because they're having to pay all of it. And then the problem there is basically it then sets up the small business having a much higher price than the Walmart down the street, which can negotiate to split the tariff. It's a really bad dynamic in that regard. And the markup, again, it's huge, but it's one thing if you're doing that over the rent for a store and it's a small business versus if you're a Walmart or whatever and you have so much money you can float years of maybe not making as much profit. So for the small guys, it's a real problem.
David?
I'm confused because, Laura, you helped block the Obama administration from signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. I always thought Congress had to approve trade deals. When did the president suddenly get unilateral power to negotiate all by himself?
So this is a very interesting question. So they can negotiate. They always have had the right to negotiate. It's part of their foreign policy rights. What they can't do, though, exactly what you're saying, is sign agreements, make agreements unilaterally. And in fact, one of the clearest checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution is around trade. Article 1(8), Clause 8, Article 1, Clause 8, for friends reading along at home, gives explicit authority over tariffs. They call them duties. It's capital D-U-T-I-S. It's an old-fashioned word for tariff in the Constitution. Also, another clause in Clause 8 is regulating commerce with foreign nations. And that is an exclusive congressional authority. What you're begging the question of is how the hell are they doing this without having Congress involved? And the answer is, how the hell are they doing any of the things they're doing? I mean, right now in Congress today, across town, is a rescission fight to basically undo all the appropriations, another of those really clear, only Congress can do this kind of authorities. And they're basically trying to just be like, oh, well, we're giving that the raspberry. We'll just do it unilaterally. It's the same attitude. And so Congress has started a little bit to exert itself saying, wait, you can't just do this by yourself. But the Republicans have a majority in the House and the Senate, and they're all basically so scared of Trump that most of them aren't willing to challenge it. And these are a bunch of actual dyed-in-the-wool free trade lunatics. So they're every day, they're like, it's like eating ground glass to have to go along with this. But even so, there is such an absence of spinal strength to stand up on what is a fundamental congressional right that they're kind of letting him get away with it.
Anna?
Lori, a phrase I see repeated is de minimis. What is a de minimis?
So here is the good news. With all of the chaos and misuse of the tariffs, because this has been like just total tariff malpractice, and by the way, the reaction to it is like making people in reaction start like thinking, well, maybe NAFTA and TPP weren't so bad. No, folks, they still totally are terrible. So is the WTO. Just because what Trump is doing is idiotic. De minimis is one place, a ray of sunshine, because we're going to kill, replace, get rid of de minimis. And that has been a project for me of many years where people were laughing at us as recently as like 5 years ago. And we said, that's got to get thrown out. So de minimis is a loophole in U.S. customs law that says that for goods now under $800 a day imported to an individual in the U.S. every day can avoid all tariffs, all taxes, and all inspection. And this loophole has been used by the Amazons, Temus, Sheins to basically import stuff that goes around the forced labor ban, endangered species products, stuff that's like, not from those particular companies, but shady internet pharmacies, fentanyl-laced pills, all kinds of really dangerous and illegal stuff is coming in through this loophole. And an odd coalition of fentanyl, the families of fentanyl poisoning victims, of environmental groups worried about the endangered species stuff, of faith groups and unions worried about the forced labor stuff, of consumer rights organizations, of trade justice people like me, have been working to get this loophole closed. And so what ended up happening, ironically, is the Biden administration, just before they left, started to do a partial closing. The Trump administration picked that up and closed it down for China. So right now, the stuff that was sneaking in through China uninspected, untariffed, untaxed has been stopped. That's since May 1st. And now we're waiting for a new executive order that would stop de minimis imports from all the rest of the world. And then seeing the writing on the wall, part of that horrible, big bastardly bill has in it a phase out by 2027 by statute of de minimis, changing the Trade Act of 1930 permanently and just getting rid of it for all commercial goods. And that, by the way, brings us up to speed with what the European Union is doing, what South Africa, Brazil, Mexico have already done. Basically, the big online retailers took a thing that had some logic, abused it, twisted it, blasted it open, and now, thank God, the United States is about to join the crew that's getting rid of it. And that will be a good, positive thing that will have happened, perhaps the only, with this administration on trade.
On that point, we're out of time. I've been talking with Lori Wallach, heading Rethink Trade, and before that, for many years, the head of Global Trade Watch, a public citizen. Before we leave, Lori Wallach, give our listeners that website again so they can cogitate about the pluses and minuses of all this as we move into the rest of the year and all the deadlines that Trump is imposing on all these countries.
Thank you all for the opportunity to join you. And listeners, you can learn about de minimis, you can learn more about the tariffs, you can find that tariff measuring tool, and much, much more at rethinktrade.org. That's www.rethinktrade.org. If you also want to see how your member of Congress has voted on trade over time, we have the updated trade vote tracking chart. So you can see exactly where your member of Congress has come down on these issues over time. They're all going to be home for all of August recess. They're supposed to go out of Washington to be home for 6 weeks this time at the end of July. So find them at a picnic, find them in a parade, tell them you want trade justice, you want actually trade that works for working people, the environment, the planet, and safety. And if we all work hard, we can actually achieve that, as the de minimis victory shows. So that's rethinktrade.org.
There you are, listeners, right on your table. Go to work on it. Be part of the solution. Thank you very much, Lori Wallach.
Thank you all.
We've been speaking with Lori Wallach. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank both of our guests again, Bruce Fein and Lori Wallach. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, it's at capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Step up, you ought to step up. Rise up, I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up. You've been saying, I think you should step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up, don't let the system hold you down. Stand up, stand up. You've been saying.